Bunch of teams wrapping up spring practice this week. One of those is the Oklahoma Sooners. Their spring game is Saturday. Eddie Radosevich, George Stoia III from SoonerScoop joining me now. We got to talk Sooners entering the SEC, spring practice, and also, well, let's just cut to the chase, boys. What's going on with the offensive line?
Oh boy,
what a great start.
If we had like any money to show for any knowledge about what's going on, it's not been good. I think that those kind of problems have kind of seeped into the larger picture of just in terms of the fact that the Troy Everett injury was obviously at an awful time. It's good news that he's not going to be out for the season, but at the same time, you look at an offensive line that was having to reshuffle quite a few positions, guys that were coming in as mid-year transfers. It's gone probably good, but I would say I wouldn't characterize it as a bunch of guys that have stepped in and just really certainly wowed a lot of people. I think Fabechi Wewewu from North Texas has certainly kind of locked down one of the guard positions, but the overall picture of the Oklahoma offensive line coming out of spring is probably not something that would bring a lot of praise from the Oklahoma fan base. And that's where you get into like the bigger questions about like, has Jackson Arnold been able to develop because the offensive line's been so bad throughout the spring? I don't know. It's been a big question mark.
I think the biggest thing, Andy, is having to replace 5 guys is difficult. And I think they like some of the pieces they have, but all of a sudden you lose your guy that you were expecting to start at center in Troy Everett to a knee injury. And it sounds like they hope to have him back by the start of the season. We'll see. They're bringing in Branton Hickman, the transfer from SMU this weekend, who's very experienced at center. I would assume they will take him if they can get him. And then you look at the guard spots. You've had some nice play from, like Eddie said, Fabechi Wewewu, and then Heath Ozeda, who's a second-year guy, Jacob Sexton, who was playing right tackle last year. Sounds like they've moved him to guard maybe. You've got Michael Tarquin from USC, the transfer. He's been playing some left tackle. And then that right tackle spot, they thought Spencer Brown from Michigan State was going to be a plug-and-play type guy. That has not been the case. And so you're talking about every position still feels up for grabs. You were hoping that maybe after spring, some of these guys would lock down some of these spots. And it sounds like other than Weewu, they haven't really had anybody that's kind of come in and said, this is going to be my starting spot. So I think that they have a lot of question marks. And look, I think that some of it is,
it all comes with a qualifier too,
yeah,
because of the way the Bill Beatabo processes
he tinkers
everything
with guys. He moves guys around different positions. And so they still have some time, but we also expect them to go out in the portal here in the spring and try to add at least probably 2 guys.
Yeah, and that's the hardest thing to do right now as we look at, the portal's been open for a little bit now, and we're looking at the guys who are coming in. And it's funny because before we got on the air, I was talking to you guys and I said, oh, Arkansas has a tackle in the portal, and you caught me and you're like, well, no, he can't come if he wants to play, because Oklahoma now in the SEC, now following the SEC rule that if you played at an SEC school last year, you can't transfer in the spring and play right away at another SEC school. So it also limits the pool of what they can take.
Yeah, and that's been, something I remember I called the SEC offices, like I think it was like a couple months ago, and it was just like, hey, what's the clarification on this rule for OU and Texas? And they just said, hey,
oh boy, this guy again.
Yeah, they said, hey, OU and Texas, they are currently abiding by the rules, even though they're not officially league members till July 1st. They have to abide by these rules. And so any of these guys that are entering from SEC schools, I know there's been, some defensive linemen, I think from Ole Miss or Texas A&M. And, you mentioned the offensive tackle from Arkansas. Like people on our board are like, oh, well, you should go after him. It's like they can go after him and get him, but they can't play next year, based on SEC rules. So that limits the pool tremendously. And there hasn't been a ton of guys in the portal on the offensive line, especially that I think that OU is particularly interested in right now, other than, like I said, Branson Hickman from SMU that, he started 33 games there at center. So I think they're still waiting and seeing. Maybe some guys will pop here in the next couple weeks. You never know, but right now it's definitely a limited group.
Well, and George, I hope you didn't call Birmingham on the same day I did. So shout out Chuck Dunlap and Herb Vincent at the SEC and William King also for clarifying those rules for us, because that is one of those things that, like, you don't think about. Oklahoma and Texas do not officially join until July 1st. So you got to figure out how everything works. Besides that, that side of the line of scrimmage, I know defensive line is a position where they feel pretty good about the first line guys, but how about depth?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the biggest question mark, and especially when in terms of guys that enter the portal here over the next 14, 15 days, is if you have experience, if you fit kind of a mold of a roster of obviously over 300 pounds, I think Oklahoma's probably going to take a look at you. I think that they feel pretty good about the depth that they've been able to build. But once again, it's a bunch of guys that have simply not played a whole lot of college football specifically. And obviously when you're talking about the two defensive linemen that came in as true freshmen in David Stone and Jaden Jackson from IMG. But at the same time, I think that we've heard some good things about Devon Sears, who returns to Oklahoma this next season. We've heard good things about Grayson Halton, but they haven't really been able to really take that next step on the field. And I think that there is a big question mark in terms of what is behind some of these frontline guys that Oklahoma is going to throw out, because everywhere else on the defense, every level, it seems, George, is really, really good from a depth perspective.
I think the biggest thing, Andy, is right now they want to have a 6-man rotation on that defensive line. And you have DJ Terry, who played a lot of snaps last year up front, and you feel really good about him. But they lose Jacob Lacey for the season due to blood clots. He's going to be out. They were really counting on him starting next year and being that guy. I mean, he played the most snaps of any defensive tackle last year for Oklahoma. So now you're trying to replace that with, either a young freshman like Jaden Jackson, who has had a really good spring and is probably ahead of where anybody anticipated. And David Stone, too. I think David Stone has done a really nice job. Then you have a bunch of guys that are, Devon Sears. You've got Grayson Halton. You've got, Ashton Sanders, Marcus Strong, guys that just haven't played but have been in the program for a couple years. So I think Oklahoma looks at the portal and says, if we can go out and get a guy that's, been a 2-year starter, has played some, quality snaps, whether that's at the Power 5 level or the Group of 5 level, they just need somebody that has some football experience, because you're talking about guys that they think they have good potential, but no one's really played that much football.
Yeah, I think that's the fear coming into the league. The SEC being a heavy line of scrimmage league, you worry that if you don't feel comfortable having a 2-deep D-line rotation, if you don't feel like you have 8 offensive linemen who can play, that's where it gets a little dicey. With this roster, I'm trying to think, Brent Venables came in and started remaking the roster pretty quickly through the transfer portal. How different is the roster now than, say, when they decided they were going to go to the SEC?
I think it's tremendously different. I mean,
night and day from what it was. But again, especially on the defensive side, from where it was, obviously was so far below the the bar of what Oklahoma needs to be or should be, that they had to kind of dig themselves out. And they seemingly have done that when we've been able to go out to practice here over the last couple of weeks.
I would even say, defensively, we just went through the defensive line and said they would like to add 1 or 2 guys. I still think the defensive line is ahead of where they were, just a few years ago.
Sure.
When you look at the body types and the talent level of these guys, the ceilings that they could have. Now they're young and they're inexperienced, but I think they have way more talent up front than they did a few years ago. And then you just go down the line. Linebacker, we know Danny Stutzman, Kip Lewis, Kobe McKenzie, Jaron Kanik, Lewis Carter, Samuel Masigo, Dasan McCullough. They have so many guys that could be starters elsewhere at linebacker. It's pretty incredible. Corners the same way, and even safety. And those are some positions that we've kind of looked at and said, we wouldn't be shocked if some of these guys entered the spring portal, just because the number situation. They don't know how they're going to get all these guys onto the field because they have so many bodies. And then I think on the offensive side, the quarterback room is certainly better than what it was in terms of having, Jackson Arnold. You bring in Casey Thompson, who's a very veteran guy that can be your backup next year. Michael Hawkins has had an incredible spring. Then you look at receiver. I think that they're pretty deep there. I don't know if they have a superstar just yet, but I do think that it's the deepest the room has been under Brent Venables for sure. And Emmett Jones has done a good job there. And then the tight end room, Andy, is the one room that I would say has changed the most over the course of the last year. They've gotten some really good bodies in there. Obviously, 5-star Devon Mitchell is someone to watch, but they bring in the transfer Jake Roberts from Baylor, who's a nice player, who's played a lot of football. And then Bauer Sharp. He's probably been the standout.
The talk of the camp so far, just in terms of what he's been able to do to the tight end room. That simply wasn't used a whole lot last year. I think the tight end position for Oklahoma had 20 receptions a year ago. You almost kind of feel like I think Bauer Sharp could take care of that in the first handful of games before they even go on the road to Auburn at the end of September.
Bauer Sharp, Southeastern Louisiana transfer, great trust fund tight end name. You got to like the trust fund tight ends.
No doubt.
Lawson Lucky at Georgia, that's another one. That if they sound like they come with a 10-figure trust fund, I think you got a dude.
If they're going to be on that Sigma Nu fraternity list, down in Oxford at some point in his career,
exactly.
And he's exceptional too. And he kind of has a fun story, just coming from high school where he played quarterback, and it was one of those guys that George wrote about on SoonerScoop, just in terms of was a guy that COVID really hit him hard in his recruitment, and he had to kind of find a path to really high level football, and he's now in Norman. So he's really been kind of the talk of camp.
Super athletic, can run, and is a guy that they feel like can do some different things. And last year that was a position that, Austin Stogner, he was a warrior in terms of playing every snap for them at tight end. He just was not very dynamic. I think that they're going to be a lot more dynamic at that position. And when you talk about having, Seth Luttrell and Joe John Finley, a guy that played fullback and a guy that played tight end at Oklahoma, you would think they're going to use that position quite a bit.
So we're going to get a look at the Seth Luttrell and Joe John Finley offense on Saturday. How different do you think it's going to look than the Jeff Lebby offense?
I think there's going to be a lot of people that walk away from Saturday, particularly in a controlled scrimmage environment, and go, this is the same thing that we've seen over the last couple of years, which, if they could just get half of the production that Dylan Gabriel and Jeff Lebby got over the last 2 years in Norman, I think that for the most part everybody would be fine as long as they run the ball in Lawrence, or as long as they able to move the ball and pick up first downs in Stillwater. Nobody probably would have been complaining. But at the same time, I do think that you are going to see some differences in terms of just overall style of what they want to be able to do. I know that Seth has been quoted as saying you could ask 10 different people in all of his different stops, whether it be in Indiana or North Carolina or North Texas, and they would all probably give you 10 different answers on how you characterize, Seth's offense overall. But at the same time, I do think that, you're going to want to be able to use Jackson Arnold in the run game, as well as kind of lean on a run game, which is kind of interesting considering all the offensive line problems they've had this spring.
I think the two biggest differences you're going to see, Andy, are I think the speed, the pace at which they play. I do think they're going to slow down a little bit. That's not to say they won't do some no huddle and go tempo and those sorts of things. But Oklahoma the last couple of years have been, one of the fastest teams in college football. I do think they'll slow down just a little bit on offense. And then I think the run game is where you're going to see some different things schematically. I think they'll get back to some of that GT counter and outside zone that Bill Beatenbow is really used to as an offensive line coach. Him and Seth Luttrell are obviously very close and see a lot of things similarly. They kind of got away from some of that stuff the last couple of years, especially last year until late in the year when they really kind of found their groove. They were doing more simple things in the running games. I think you're going to see that. And I just think that in terms of his play calling style, Seth Luttrell is going to want to lean on the run game in a lot of ways. And I know that he's also known for throwing the ball around the yard. And I think you're going to see a lot of vertical passing and also some horizontal passing that we saw in the Jeff Lebby offense. But from my understanding, this spring has been a lot about trying to emphasize the run game, because they knew last year they weren't good enough there. And in tight games, you have to be able to run the football. And I think that that's what you're going to see maybe the biggest difference in terms of what they're doing schematically is in the run game.
Talk dirty to me, boys. GT counter. Love to hear it. Love to hear it. We were talking G lead sweeps yesterday with UNLV's offensive coordinator. So we're all over the place in the run game, but we have large people moving very fast, and that's what I like to see. But the point you bring up is good though, because I just feel like tempo at this point has to be variable. Like you have to be able to dial it up, dial it down, depending on what you need. I feel like the teams that only run at one pace, whether that be slow or fast, it's almost like in baseball, like a hitter can time up 100-mile-an-hour fastball. That's all you can throw. But if you've got an 83-mile-an-hour changeup that has a little drop to it, he's screwed.
Yeah.
And I would say too, Andy, part of the issue with OU's offense the last couple of years is it felt like they were just running tempo to try and catch the defense off guard and it was a 4th and 1 and they'd rush to the line instead of just saying, hey, it's going to be 4th and 1. We're just going to run the ball down the throw. And I think
there's a lot of Oklahoma fans over the last couple of years, particularly, they would have been more comfortable in 3rd and 13 than they probably were in 3rd and short or 4th and 1, which is just insane.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest thing with the tempo is like, it felt like at times they were just running it to try and get the defense off guard. And that was kind of their identity. And I think they're going to go back to, again, Seth Luttrell's going to run some tempo. He did it in North Texas. He did it in North Carolina when he was the OC, Indiana, all those places. But I think there's a time and place for it. And I don't think it's going to be one of those situations where they're just every possession is, a minute or 2 minutes long, like it was under Jeff Lebby.
Now, Jackson Arnold, he's the guy. We know that. They let Dylan Gabriel go to Oregon. How's he coming along? Where does he need to work? And where he needs to be?
It's the most fascinating conversation I think that nobody wants to have in Norman, just in terms of what his development has been. When we saw him on the field in the Alamo Bowl, there was some really, really good, but on the flip side of that, there was some bad. I mean, you turn the ball over 6 times, you're not going to win very many games, whether it be home or away next season in the SEC. And I think that just decision making. We talked to some of the players, and I think it was Jaden Gibson on last week when we talked to him on Friday, just in terms of he's been really good about bouncing back and forgetting some of the bad throws. And it's like, well, how many of those bad throws have there been? With that said, I still think that there is a feeling, there's a belief around Norman that he's going to be the next great Oklahoma quarterback. There's obvious tools and, some of the stuff and some of the throws that he made in San Antonio against Arizona, but it's going to be interesting to me, at least going into this next season, how you navigate those freshman ups and downs that are still going to come, even despite him still being in Norman for having, a game under his belt and having played periodically throughout the year, specifically, coming in Provo and things like that. So the good is really, really good. I think it's going to be about how quickly he can get over some of these missteps, how quickly you can get over a turnover, whether it be in Auburn or Oxford or Columbia or wherever next season. You're going to have to probably rely on a defense that, again, as we were talking about, they return so many guys. There's a belief that they could take that next step under Brent on the defensive side. What have you thought, George?
Yeah, the latest scrimmage, Andy, we heard that Arnold threw 2 touchdowns and he also threw 2 interceptions. And I think he's going to have games like that next year where you're like, man, this guy is on fire and he's dealing, and then he makes a couple bad mistakes. And that's going to happen. And that's just some of the growing pains when you have, a 19-year-old, 20-year-old at quarterback. But I think that his ceiling is still incredibly high. When you talk about the ability to throw the football, the accuracy, all of those things, arm strength, he's got all of that. I think his ability to run, we're going to see a lot of that next year too. And I think that's going to be a part of what they're doing schematically. But I think that it's just going to be a growing process for him next year. And I think that fans need to be patient with him because I think he'll get better as the season goes on. The only problem is the opponents get a lot better as the season goes on for Oklahoma. So I still have a lot of faith in him. I just think that people need to be ready for him to turn the ball over a few times. I think the biggest thing for him right now is trusting in the offensive line, which is a tough thing to do when they're constantly rotating guys and trying to figure out who their best 5 are. I think if he can trust that offensive line and stay in that pocket, he's going to make good decisions. It's when he feels like he can't and he has to make a quick decision or a decision too early, and he maybe makes the wrong decision. So I think that that's all part of the growing process. And look, we just haven't heard a whole lot of, Jackson Arnold's been amazing, but we also haven't heard Jackson Arnold's been terrible.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's worried that he's going to be a bust as much as they're just going to have to kind of grow through some of the growing pains that do happen for a freshman quarterback, which I think for Oklahoma fans in a way, because they've been so blessed by the transfer portal, dating all the way back to Baker, Kyler, Jalen, Dylan, they were all really, really good about the turnover issue. There was never a turnover issue in Norman. I think that that's going to be kind of the biggest hurdle in between this team being, I think, decently pretty good, and maybe you're having to battle and win a couple of these coin flip games that we've talked to you about before, Andy.
So was the last regular Oklahoma quarterback starter who was recruited by Oklahoma out of high school Trevor Knight?
Yeah.
Well, Rattler.
Yeah.
I guess Spencer Rattler. That's right. That's right. Spencer Rattler. That's
Williams.
So have memory hold that. Memory hold 2022. Golly. 2021. Excuse me. Yeah, it seems like so long ago, but yes. Wow.
20
So
and
he's the-
2021 have been like just completely ex-nayed from
Yeah,
the
people just
Oklahoma
backed
like
out.
file system
Other
outside
than
of the
OU
21
Texas.
OU Texas
Yeah,
game.
yeah.
Yeah.
man. But you're right. I mean, they have had so many good portal quarterbacks, but they've also just had so many good quarterbacks because Spencer Rattler was a good quarterback. He just wasn't Caleb Williams. And I think that, at first people thought that meant he wasn't very good. It turns out he's actually pretty good. And we'll see that probably in the draft. But it's an amazing lineage they got going there. But it's easy to forget that most of those guys did come from somewhere else. So good luck with the homegrown Jackson Arnold, and maybe a little bit of a roller coaster. Get the free preview on Saturday, boys. Thank you so much.
Andy, appreciate it.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.